What's an AI-related question you think CFOs should be asking?
Oh,
Airbnb, the company that disrupted the hotel industry, now wants to become your one-stop shop for all of your travel needs.
Now you can get a chef on Airbnb. Don't just see Seoul. 3 ways to experience it on Airbnb.
Go with Fernanda through Mexican modern boutiques and showrooms.
There was once a time when the idea sounded almost absurd. Strangers sleeping on air mattresses in someone else's living room. But that experiment would go on to change the way millions of people travel. Today, Airbnb is a $12 billion public company that has helped redefine hospitality by making travel feel more personal, flexible, and accessible for both hosts and guests. Behind that growth is a leadership team that has had to evolve just as quickly as the company itself. And few people have had a closer view of that journey than Airbnb CFO Ellie Mertz, a 13-year veteran who helped build the company's financial backbone through rapid expansion, uncertain markets, and moments of global crisis.
a manager's role is to provide context, not control.
Now, she's helping steer Airbnb's next chapter. I'm Ruth Umoh, and this is Fortune Next to Lead. Ellie Mertz, Airbnb CFO, thank you so much for joining us on Fortune Next to Lead.
Thank you for hosting me. Great to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's just start with the CFO role. I'm curious, what is one misconception, perhaps that boards, maybe your C-suite peers and other functions, even outsiders, have about what the CFO actually does?
I don't know if it's a misconception or just a generalization about the CFO and the finance organization is that it's fundamentally only a controlling organization. So looking to put in limits, constraints, rules. And through my career and in particular at Airbnb, I've seen my role and my team's role is much more expansive. Obviously, there is a controlling function to finance, but it's also about helping facilitate our vision. So figuring out what's the path to get from where we are today to where we want to go. And in that way is much more of a thought partner and facilitator versus simply a controller.
That's a perfect segue into my next question because finance gives you this uniquely panoramic view of the organization. So as CFO, how do you decide when to lean in as a strategic thought partner, as you phrased it, versus when to simply step in as a financial constraint and say, hey, this simply doesn't clear the bar?
I encourage my team to have a cross-functional, holistic view really on any project because if you don't have the full perspective and context on what we're trying to achieve as a company beyond just the financials, you often self-edit ideas internally. And to my prior comment, I don't want to be an organization that is self-editing or constraining our creativity and therefore our innovation. Instead, I want to be a thought partner to understand, what do my peers want to achieve and how can my team help them get there?
Yeah. Give me a for instance of how that's played out in real time, serving as a thought partner.
Yeah, so I think anytime at Airbnb that we're looking at what's the next thing that we are going to invest in, it's very easy for my team to, quickly to think about what's that next big opportunity from a revenue perspective. At the same time, we need to be conscious of what's not only a big revenue opportunity, but what's also going to be, brand accretive, what's going to increase engagement for our guests and hosts, and what's going to further our mission. In particular, what can we do in terms of our products and services that enable more in-person connection? I think you've seen that in terms of our most recent releases, obviously, with our reimagined experiences offering last year. We obviously have the aspiration to build that into a scalable standalone business, a material incremental revenue stream. We also want to make sure that we are focusing on delivering a product that is not just something, good to do and good for our business, but is good for bringing people together in person to experience the world together.
I'm curious how your leadership style or behavior has changed since ascending into the C-suite. Any leadership behaviors that you had to unlearn?
So, I've actually been at the company for 13 years. It's been quite a, I would say, whirlwind experience in terms of the scaling that we've seen. So lo and behold, over a dozen years later, over 12 billion. So there's been a huge amount of scaling over that time. I would say, even prior to taking the CFO role 2 years ago, when you're experiencing that much scaling, every single year you really need to adapt your skill set, your leadership style, and your approach, because the challenges for a $200 million company are fundamentally different than a $2 billion company. And so
Give me
as
a
you
for
continue
instance. Can you make that really concrete for us?
in the early days, you are, frankly, trying to build the infrastructure, the people, the processes, the technology to support the ambition, right? That the business has exceeded the company, meaning in our case, the business realization, meaning having a product that people loved, a strong revenue stream, great fundamentals of economics. We were able to get to those relatively quickly, obviously after the cold start program or problem. But we got to a substantial business size without having put in the organizational structure to support that level of growth, let alone to support our ambitions. Fast forward to where we are today, we've spent quite a bit of time building out all of the kind of obvious corporate functions and capabilities that you would want for a public company at this scale. And the immediate challenge is really, what can we offer for our guests and hosts that allow us to not only accelerate the business growth, but also offer more things, frankly, that people want, that allow us to be a more regular engagement partner with our users.
Yeah. And so your leadership has adapted and evolved now in what way?
My leadership is trying to evolve to the priority of the day. We have big ambitions to reaccelerate Airbnb, to not just add incremental offerings, which we started to do last year, but also reaccelerate our core business. And so huge focus that I have right now is working across the organization to really I would say uncover where we have growth opportunities that we can lean further in, we can invest and deliver the growth that we are aspiring to.
Talk to us about some of those opportunities. Where do you see white space at this point?
Airbnb has grown dramatically, has tremendous brand awareness in certain markets, but at the same time we have quite uneven levels of penetration around the world. And so over the last couple of years, what you've seen us do is make very concentrated investment bets in expansion markets. A good example of that would be Brazil. We started investing a few years ago in terms of obviously localizing the marketing, but also localizing the product. And we've seen tremendous growth in that market. I bring that up as a use case because as an American traveler, I think there's the presumption that not all, but many people have tried Airbnb, and we look across even our core markets and we find significant portions of travelers that are aware of Airbnb, but they haven't yet tried us. And so, you see us increasingly look to make sure that we are solving some consideration gaps, meaning we are making sure Airbnb is even more reliable and consistent than it has been historically. We've made material investments in quality. We're also making sure that we are affordable. We know consumers care about price. We know travel is competitive. And we want to always make sure that we're offering significant value. So there's a huge, I would say, white space just around continuing to drive consideration and penetration of our core offering.
You gave Brazil as an example. You said you're localizing the product, localizing the market. What do you mean by that when you use the term localizing the product?
So we have been, I would say, quite successful with a single app that is fundamentally quite the same around the world. And what we've noted over the last couple of years is that that global app has been wildly successful in most markets, but there are things that we need to do for particular regions and countries to make sure that the product works as the consumer would expect it to be. I think an obvious area of continued investment in a market like Brazil is making sure that we have the appropriate payment methods that consumers are looking for. So, one localization specific to Brazil is installment payments, something that would not be, frankly, very attractive for a US consumer, but is pretty standard for a lot of big ticket purchases in Brazil. So we began offering that a few years ago. We more recently expanded the program to make those installments free to consumers. And it's been a huge lever for growth in that market. There's lots of things like that that allow us to tap into local behavior, local expectations to make the product more localized for the guests and hosts that we serve across the world.
I'm obviously quite familiar with Airbnb as a user, but also as a business journalist. When you look at the Airbnb trajectory, when you look at its business story, it seems like monumental growth year after year. You all, I believe, joined the Fortune 500 in 2023. You're now in the 300s, I think a roughly 70 spot jump. So even as you look at revenue, it's continuous growth. However, every CFO presumably has at least one moment where there's downside risk or where they're facing a real crisis. I'm curious a crisis you have faced and how that shaped you, whether it was at Airbnb, prior to Airbnb, and what was instructive about it?
There's kind of two moments in my career where there were significant crises that my company was dealing with. The most recent would obviously be the pandemic and its impact on Airbnb. Back in March of 2020, we were beginning the process to go public and to file our S1, and the pandemic hit. Our business effectively collapsed over a matter of weeks, and we found ourselves quite desperate to make sure that, number one, we were protecting and serving our guests and hosts appropriately, and second, that we were preserving cash to make sure that we could survive effectively what was a very uncertain time. There's been much written about that moment of crisis. I think when I think about my particular role and the lessons there, I think first and foremost is about being decisive. The lesson I think we all learned, but myself in particular, was not to be paralyzed by the extent of the uncertainty, but instead to collect as much information as possible, make educated guesses, and move with haste. And it really set us up well for when the world began to come out a bit later. For us to be the travel brand that recovered from the pandemic the most quickly and the most dramatically.
Yeah, really taking that long-term view. You mentioned the fact that there was a second crisis that ultimately turned out to be personally rewarding and transformative. What was the second one?
Yes. So I had the good fortune of working at Netflix prior to being at Airbnb, and I was there during a handful of transformations from DVD to streaming, from US based to global. And then obviously from licensed content to originals. And, given the scale of that business today, sometimes it's hard to remember kind of where it started. And back in 2011, when we were trying to more fully launch the streaming product, we separated DVD from streaming and had quite a negative impact with regard to our subscribers, the level of churn, and the business impact. And, from my vantage point, I was running investor relations during that period, and Netflix lost about 70% of market cap in 3 months. So very difficult period in terms of being at a very beloved brand and making a material misstep that really lost a lot of, I would say, consumer confidence in the brand. And when I look back at that period, I think the first lesson was one of accountability. As soon as we collectively had kind of understood the misstep, there was a recognition that we'd made a mistake. And the second, lesson was thinking about what made the brand great to begin with, and how do we get up tomorrow and go back to being that great brand. Within months after that real dent in terms of consumer sentiment, the business continued where it was going, continued to invest in what was going to be a great streaming product, but didn't let the crisis cause a permanent stumble with regard to the overall direction that it was headed.
In moments like that, in moments of crisis, what ultimately matters more? Is it moving quickly with imperfect information? Is it taking the time to pressure test assumptions, to run, scenarios to narrow the margin for error? And how do you determine the trade-off?
First and foremost, it's important to have a set of common principles that the organization is leading itself through. I think making quick decisions was certainly one of them. I think a more broad principle that we held throughout the organization was the intent to not just survive the moment, but to emerge as a stronger company. We really were trying to play the long game, and that principle caused us to make some decisions that frankly were quite expensive upfront, but were really important brand investments. So an example I would give there was at the height of, or I should say the trough of the immediate impact of the pandemic, we had a choice to make in terms of would we allow our guests to cancel their upcoming bookings? For those bookings that were not otherwise, free to cancel. And the decision we made internally was absolutely, yes, we should stand by our guests, not encourage them to take travel during a very precarious period, but honor free cancellations and allow them to obviously stay safe within their homes. We, at the same time, paid out our hosts a considerable amount of the underlying bookings that would not be realized. And the decision making there was certainly not a financial decision. It was a decision to say, we want this brand to emerge from this crisis stronger. And that means that we make some, very difficult short-term decisions to stand by both sides of our marketplace, such that hopefully when, that crisis passed, people feel great about the brand because we acted appropriately in supporting our guests and hosts during a very difficult period.
In 2024, Airbnb delivered some $80 billion in booking value. I'm sure you have more updated numbers, largely from its core rental, short-term rental product. How do you think about protecting Airbnb's powerful engine, which is that, while still ensuring that the company is investing early enough in whatever comes next?
I think the core business, continues to have a lot of white space in terms of growth. At the same time, we are eagerly developing new products and services to expand that reach with our consumers. This past May, we obviously launched a reimagined experiences product as well as services. And the broader vision there is really to provide a fantastic trip, make sure that those individuals staying in Airbnbs have great experiences when they're, traveling the world, they are doing things in person and feeling like they are having authentic local experiences that get them to know those cities more intimately. And at the same time, we're increasingly providing services that frankly make us more competitive with hotels where, we know many people choose hotels based on the services that they provide.
What is the hardest growth trade-off Airbnb faces today?
I think broadly, and would not be unique to Airbnb, I think broadly the challenge is understanding how much you should continue to invest in your core business while also isolating and protecting investments for the things that we, for example, launched last year and the things that we want to launch a few years from now. And so what we've evolved towards is really a balanced portfolio allocation of our investment decisions. We're trying to have great continued growth of the core business. So we are obviously continuing to invest a lot there. We're also carving out dedicated budgets and investment levels for those new businesses as well as those future incubations such that we can deliver consistent, solid growth for years to come.
Yeah, let's dig into that investment discussion. AI presents unique risks for CFOs. Invest too little, you fall behind, but over invest and you risk chasing hype and potentially not see an ROI. Which for you is more risky, and how do you navigate that tension?
There's really two focus areas. One is obviously how do you leverage AI to make the product better for your guests and hosts? We've done a lot of work there, more to come in terms of what consumers will see later this year and in the future. We're very focused on incorporating AI into our search product and making, frankly, the overall online experience with Airbnb better. So that's one big area. The second area is all the things that we are doing internally. So it's, how do you ensure that all of your software engineers are using tools to make their coding more efficient? More broadly, it's looking across functions of the org to say, where can AI make work more efficient, more effective, and how can we use AI to get those efficiencies while also providing the opportunity to better leverage our human capital? What gets me really excited is thinking about the trajectory where a lot of rote tasks, for example, are kind of out of humans' workflows because they are being taken care of AI, and we can provide better opportunities for our employees to be doing, every year more high impact work because we've leveraged AI significantly.
Yeah. Where are you seeing AI deliver real efficiencies, especially as you look across these
Yep.
functions? I know a lot of executives, they say, gets rid of rote tasks, more uniquely human work. What does that actually mean in a material way?
So I think the most obvious from the Airbnb perspective is the agent that we've provided to our customer service contacts. So we last year rolled out a AI agent for guests and hosts reaching out to customer service. That has been very effective. It effectively allows one, a reduction in the number of contacts that need to go to a human agent. It also gets easier, better, higher satisfaction results for our guests and hosts by getting them what they need very quickly without having to go through a human. So you'll see us, continue to invest there. I'd say more broadly, when we look at corporate functions, there's been a huge amount of benefit in terms of, for example, in the finance organization, implementing tools that just allow better, easier data access, in particular for those consumers of data that aren't terribly technical, usually need to rely on someone else to pull data or to do various analyses for them. Huge opportunity in terms of continuing to leverage AI to get answers more quickly and allow for, frankly, more thoughtful analysis and decision making from the data.
I'm so glad you said that. And I want to kind of dig in one notch further because AI is certainly changing the role of finance leaders, not just the tools, but also I'm assuming the judgments that they'd now be expected to make. So how is that changing your role? How is AI changing your role, specifically the judgments you now have to make?
I think you can get to the discussion, the debate, and the judgment much quicker because the path to collecting, assessing, aggregating the data and the information required can be so much quicker. So I think there's a acceleration in decision making where we've leveraged AI to get the appropriate data collected.
What's an AI related question you think CFOs should be asking, but
Oh,
often are not?
well, I think broadly, the question right now, which is probably where you started this conversation, is how tight should the visibility be around ROI when we're
Mhm.
in such an early period of this technological transformation? I think, the broad question is each of us are making AI investments today that both the duration and the impact of the ROI are frankly quite uncertain. But at the same time, we're not going to sit on our hands waiting for the perfect ROI when we want to make sure that we are continuing to innovate, that we are at the front versus the back of this technological transformation. And so I think there's a bit of a art and science right now in terms of understanding and assessing how much should we be investing versus, great clarity with regard to what the ROI looks like.
What was the last thing you used AI for, personally or
Oh,
professionally?
yesterday, I used our internal AI tools to do a first draft of a memo that in a year ago or 2 years ago, I would have pulled all the information myself and, painfully drafted myself. And I got a first draft, which obviously I'll edit. But, you just think about the savings of time and information discovery that even very basic uses of AI can deliver. Is great.
Yeah. Well, as AI capabilities expand, CFOs are increasingly forced to think about the economics of human capital. So, how do you decide what truly requires human judgment versus what can be automated without
It's a great
eroding the company's long-term value?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I would say in the finance world, uh, I'm less worried about eroding human capital versus leveraging it more. So I think about think about a broad finance organization in terms of the accounting group, et cetera. There's a huge amount of work that has been traditionally automated to make sure that our employees are better leveraged. With AI, I think there's another step change coming where we will be able to frankly create better careers for individuals because a lot of the frankly more rote tasks are taken care of for them.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Ellie. A trend I've seen is there's been noticeable hesitation among CEOs, certainly CFOs, to publicly discuss labor savings from AI, even when the efficiency gains are very real. Do you think that restraint will persist, or will we see a shift toward more explicit conversations as shareholder expectations evolve?
I think it'll probably be different for different companies. What I would
Yeah.
say is at Airbnb currently, many of our AI savings we've reinvested. So a good example of that would be I just shared with you the fact that we have launched an agent for handling customer service tickets. We didn't take those savings and drop them all to the bottom line. Instead, what we did was reinvested some of those savings so that we can provide even better service for those customer service contacts that require a human touch. So making sure that those customers booking at higher price points are getting excellent premium customer service. So I think you'll see, I use that example because I do think you'll see a lot of reinvestment in terms of human capital versus reductions.
Yeah. At Airbnb specifically, or are you speaking broadly?
I think both.
Okay. I want to talk about your management philosophy and how that has changed from when you started early in your career to now. How do you manage now?
I actually think I manage pretty consistently over the last several years. The management style that I've adopted comes from my days at Netflix. One of the principles that they have is a manager's role is to provide context, not control. And the thinking there is, your job as a manager is to go find the most talented people to fill the roles that you have, to give them context in terms of the objectives of the company or the function, and give them autonomy to go get it done instead of control. And I would say that's something that resonates with me in terms of being an employee. And I think it resonates really strongly with those employees that have initiative, have creativity to figure out the right way to handle a problem, and are fulfilled by figuring out the solution themselves. So I've kind of maintained that leadership and management style, frankly, since my days at Netflix.
Yeah. Well, I had the pleasure of interviewing Airbnb CEO Brian Chesky about a year ago. And as I'm sure you know better than anyone, the CEO CFO relationship can be one of the most consequential dynamics in a company. So, where do you and Brian push each other the most? How do you find alignment?
Brian and I are very much complements. He went to design school, I went to business school. We come at problems from really different angles. And I think that's actually a really healthy thought partnership. We don't necessarily always see the world the same way, but we have a shared interest in terms of supporting this brand, building it out globally, and frankly, doing the best for our guests and hosts. And so it's that commonality that allows us to really work through those different points of view to hopefully get to the right answers.
Well, of course, I have to ask, do you adhere to the founder's mode ideology?
I think it would be very challenging to have two executives that both exhibited founders mode. I think Brian and I complement each other in that way. I'm not in founders mode, but I am in the details. I should clarify. I'm absolutely in the details.
Looking back at your career, what role prepared you least obviously, but perhaps most meaningfully for sitting in the CFO chair?
That's a great question. I hesitate because I don't think there's one particular role or assignment. I would say more broadly, what has prepared me for this role is throughout my career being willing to take whatever assignment came up. Regardless of whether it was sexy or the next logical step on a linear career path. I think back at my days at Netflix, I took investor relations, I took payments, I figured out how to set up Latin American payments, even though that was unknown to me. Taking on those different roles, I think has been very valuable in terms of building out my skill set, and also as you make your way through an organization, creating a signal around you that you are someone who can take things on that they may not have prior experience on, and that you're willing. And I encourage everyone on my team to do that, to really be open to any experience that pops up around them, to do those two things: build out their skill set and also develop a personal brand as a go-getter, someone with initiative, and someone who can take on new challenges.
Was there a moment when you knew you were ready to be a C-suite executive, or is readiness something that you only ever see in hindsight?
Pause. I don't think there's a binary moment. I think every year through your career, you are building more readiness, and the binary moment is really when the opportunity appears itself and you take it.
Yeah, and you certainly did. Outside of your day job, you also sit on multiple boards, including that of Netflix, DoorDash as well. How does being a CFO change the way you show up as a board member, and vice versa?
At Airbnb, I started to explore board opportunities because I knew that having incremental frames of reference for my day job would be valuable. I think it's very easy when you're at a single company for a long duration. You don't frankly have as many points of reference in terms of how other companies are dealing with similar challenges. And so, having the exposure to those other two great companies has been extremely valuable to me in my day job in terms of having exposure to how would someone else handle this? What's a comparable problem that maybe, from a different cultural perspective, we will want to handle differently, but, to have the evidence and case studies that inform everyday work is extremely valuable.
Yeah. As you advanced throughout your career, were there skills you put a lot of weight on, perhaps earlier in your career, that ultimately mattered less to your success than you thought that they would?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I'm going to flip the question and say I think one of the single most important skill sets that is true for pretty much any function is around communication. Really, throughout your career, developing your ability to communicate clearly, to modulate your communication style based on the audience. Because if you can't communicate effectively, it frankly doesn't matter how technically strong you are. And that's something that I really try to emphasize with my team. If you want to be a thought partner to others, if you want to have impact outside of your function, communicating clearly is paramount.
Yeah. CFOs presumably are constantly thinking about risk, assessing risk. I'm curious whether in your personal life you're someone who is risk averse.
Oh, I don't think so, but
You don't think so? Well, I do ask that because we have a lot of aspiring executives who
yeah.
obviously watch and next to lead this podcast, and I'm curious how you think that they should think about risk, and not just the risk that they personally take, but even the reputational risk of perhaps being closely associated with high stakes outcomes. I mean, I know that's something you said throughout your career. You were willing to take on those big and meaty projects, throw your hat in the ring. I'm sure there's a lot of risk associated with that as well. So across the board, but then yet you're a CFO
Yeah.
where you're
No,
looking to narrow the downsides.
um, I think taking risk is important. I think if you constantly take the safe road, number one, you don't have a good sense of what you are capable of. You also don't have the learnings that failure provides. So taking the risk to work on those maybe high beta projects, I think is extremely valuable. It's important to signal for your brand that you're willing to take something that may not work out. You're also willing to figure out what the learnings are and apply them next time.
I want to talk about the macro environment and
Mhm.
certainly geopolitics. We're seeing consumer confidence weaken. I'm curious how you see that reflected in travel demand, in booking patterns, and certainly in pricing across Airbnb's platform.
Yes, it was interesting. I think we've had a pretty volatile period over the last year in terms of the kind of traditional consumer confidence trends. You've certainly seen some periods where there's been quite material short-term impacts in terms of, in particular, consumer confidence. Earlier in the year, with inauguration, with Liberation Day, certainly macro headlines that create uncertainty for the consumer. I'd say what we've seen on Airbnb, and this is reflective of a longer time series, not just 2025, is that travel is a large discretionary purchase. And so what we see with that is that there's often temporal movements in booking behavior, meaning if you're concerned about tariffs, there's a big headline today, you're unlikely to book that next trip tomorrow, but it doesn't mean you don't want to travel. Travel is something that people save up for. It is something that they look forward to. And I would say increasingly what we've seen is that consumers are interested in experiences as much, if not more than goods. And so people want to travel, but they do, the macro and the consumer indicators do create some volatility in terms of booking patterns.
Yeah. How are geopolitical tensions and even regional instability showing up in your data, both in terms of where guests are willing to travel, but also where hosts are choosing to supply inventory?
So I think one interesting anecdote over the last year is that travel from Canada to the US has been materially down, not just on Airbnb, but broadly from a travel perspective. And obviously that is a result of the impact of tariffs and frankly, just the overhang in terms of the negotiation between the two countries. So that one segment has seen, material decline. And yet what we see more broadly on the platform is that based on the depth and breadth of inventory that we have on Airbnb, Canadian travelers aren't traveling any less. They're just choosing to go other places. So again, that segment from Canada to the US is significantly down. But meanwhile, Canada to Mexico, Canada to France, Canada to Japan is materially up. And I think that's one of the big points of resiliency of our platform, that no matter how the wind blows, we have somewhere for you to stay virtually all over the world and at a variety of price points.
Yeah. Any uptick in Greenland?
I think we should go after more listings in Greenland.
Wholeheartedly agree. Well, let's end with these final two questions. Going through an IPO, which Airbnb did in 2020, I believe, is often a natural inflection point for executives, for those who joined early on. Was there a movement around Airbnb's IPO where you considered taking liquidity and moving on? And ultimately, what kept you here?
I think a lot of people thought that I would leave to take a CFO role somewhere else. And my consideration was, I thought that there was a lot more work and exciting opportunity for me to do at Airbnb, independent of having the CFO role. And so I decided to stay. I explored board opportunities. And then obviously, several years later, did become the CFO. I would say, broadly speaking, what has kept me at this company is our mission and the fact that we create unbelievable economic empowerment around the world. We have millions of hosts on the platform that are entrepreneurs that our marketplace has enabled. As we think about where we are in terms of broad technology shifts and people increasingly spending more time on their phones in particular, something that is core to our business is really supporting connections in the real world. And that I find, inspiring every day.
Now CFO since March 2024, what's next for you? Anything professionally you haven't done yet that's top of mind?
I'm focused on continuing to scale this business. I think we have a huge amount of white space in terms of not only our core offering, but our new businesses and future offerings. And I'm really excited to continue to build this brand.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for chatting with us and your robust insights. I'm now very keen to book an exotic travel destination, and will certainly be turning to Airbnb for my bookings.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.